Good morning, everyone. My name is Sheldon Thomas. I'm a former gang member, and for the last 27 years, I've been engaging gang members up and down this country and in parts of the Caribbean, as well as in America. And that was my speciality, engaging gang members. What we've learned over the 27 years is that things is slowly moving in terms of the way gang members go through the gang process and come out the other end and end up in prison and mental institutions. But what we found when we looked at gang members that were going into prison, you know, some going on long term, going over a long period of time, maybe over 7, 10 years or so, looking at murder or manslaughter. What we found when we went in the prisons, and this is what prisoners were telling us when they were either coming out, was that there was a very influential Muslim sect of people within the prisons that was deliberately recruiting young men who were involved in gangs. And at first, we didn't realize what the connection was, because obviously it was new to us. We didn't take much notice of it because we just thought maybe they were finding their God, so to speak. But obviously, what's happened over the last few years, we have seen quite a few young men getting caught up in the way Muslims are attracting them and radicalizing them in the prisons. When they come out, they may not go back to the gang life, but then join their Muslim brothers. But that's just one aspect of it. But today we're gonna explore how young men get caught up in gangs, the mentality behind it, and how that is connected and linked with radicalization as well. Because it isn't just radical Muslims as well. We have situations up north where young white males, white underclass, are also radicalized by the far right groups who have their own ideology. So today's process is going to look at how young men get caught up in gang violence. We're going to look at the geographical profile. That means the size of the problem, because you know, some of you may not be coming from just London. We want people to understand that gangs is a UK problem, and it isn't just a London problem, like sometimes the media likes to portray. So what we're going to do is look at this first slide, which says the geographical profile. And as you can see, I've split it into north, south, east, and west. And this is by no means a definitive names of all the gangs, because gang members change fluently. They're 1 minute they could be called Tottenham Mandem. This is a gang from up north, TMD from north of London. And tomorrow they could be called something else. So this is not a definitive list, because gang members change all the time. Today we have 50 gangs, tomorrow you've got 100. The day after you've got 150, because young men often fight against each other, split up and form new gangs and recruit younger gang members. So that's a geographical profile. This could be replicated in any city within the UK. So for instance, you'll have gangs in Nottingham, Sheffield, Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, Cardiff. Gangs are everywhere. It isn't just centered on London, and it isn't just young black kids or young Asian kids. Everybody involved in gangs that can be involved in gangs will come from a vulnerable background, maybe a broken family. So any child that is coming from particular deprived communities can and will be attracted to gangs. So people need to understand it isn't a black problem like they like to portray in London. It's a UK problem amongst all young people. And it isn't just from young people from broken families. We're now finding families from middle class areas also attracted to gang violence due to the music that they're listening to. So any young person that is vulnerable, that feels that they need a sense of belonging because there's no connection with their parents, they will be attracted to gangs. So if we go to the next slide. So if you go back one, right, if we look at this slide, this is, we call it the postcode trap. And again, this applies in any area, in any city, in any inner city as well. And what you have here are grey spots, and these grey spots define the estates that are in this particular area, and this area happen to be Hackney. And so these grey spots are not just estates, but these also have the names of the gangs that are attached to that estate. And as you can see, some of the estates where the grey spots are very close to other grey spots where the other estates are. What that tells you is that young men and involved in this lifestyle are so easily trapped, they can't even leave the estate that they're on. And in some cases, can't even leave, come out their front door in some cases, because if you're not involved in gangs and you're living on one of these estates, the chances are you may not want to come outside because you don't want to get involved with the gangs that are outside your front door, because many of these young people on these estates are not involved in gangs. And what happens is they get trapped and get caught up in that lifestyle. So for instance, if we look at one of the gangs in Hackney called Holly Street Boys, and we look at the gang which is right opposite them called the London Fields Boys, London Fields Gang. These two gangers had conflict for the last 15, maybe 17, 18 years. And you could have a young man who's never been involved in gangs who lives on that estate in Holly Street. But because he lives on that estate, he gets caught up in that senseless violence. So if he gets caught into another area, which they call slipping, if he gets caught in another area, the chances are he could either be stabbed or shot because he is associated with that estate, even though he is not a gang member. So we're talking about young men, not just a small minority of young men caught up in this lifestyle. We're talking about a majority of young men between the ages of 10 to 25 who live on particular estates, who may not be involved in gangs, are also caught up in this lifestyle because they live on a particular estate that is known for a particular gang. Also, we need to look at the fact that some of these young men have to travel on several buses just to get to their destination. Because if they travel through a gang area, they too will be targeted by other gangs. So traveling within some of these areas becomes very risky. Now, the point that I'm trying to say is that gangs isn't just what people think it is, a bunch of kids just standing on a corner. It's a way of life. It's a lifestyle that runs alongside the normal lifestyle. It's a parallel world. It's a world that is far removed from our world, that has got different rules and is run by different ways of thinking. And what we may think is normal, they don't think is normal. What they think is normal, you definitely won't think is normal. How they get to school is a struggle. How these people live on a daily basis is a struggle. How they think is often bordering on personality disorder. So we're talking about kids that are living in households, that families are broken, that the deprivation on these estates is very high. Most of these gang members live in households where there are no father figures at all, or no positive male role models. So these young men can easily be coerced by radicalizations, by young people that have different ideology. Because how you've got to look at this lifestyle is that these young kids are vulnerable children, regardless of whether they're committing acts of violence or not, or selling drugs. They're vulnerable children coming from a vulnerable background. And the attraction of gangs is just one aspect. The attraction of other things like ideologies, such as the far right or radicalized, is also another attraction for maybe the older gang members who may be getting fed up of being arrested, maybe fed up of going to prison, and are looking for another sense of belonging, something else they can call a family. And in some cases, it's the far right, and in other cases, it's radicalized Muslims. So what we need to look at is the vulnerability of children, or the vulnerability of adults, because in the same way young children are groomed into gangs, it is the same way older guys are groomed into radicalization, whether it be the far right, whether it be fundamental Muslims, or whatever it be. But they both have a situation that is happening in our society that we're not addressing, because we're trying to look at radicalization and gangs as a separate issue. We're trying to think that the way gangs work is separate to the way radicalized groups work, and they don't, because they both go after vulnerable children or vulnerable adults. That's what they do. Now, they may do it in different sense. So, for instance, the far right may target white young kids, whereas the Muslims will target white kids as well as black kids, mainly in the prison systems, because in the prisons is where many of the grooming takes place, where many of the initiation takes place. What we also need to look at as well is some of the activities that gang members get up to that actually causes their incarceration, like the drug dealing, the robbery, the fraud, the prostitution, the selling of ammunition. This is called grinding and trapping. For those who don't understand, they have their own terminology. So if we look at some of their terminologies, if we go to the next slide, if we look at their terminology, for their activities, they have a different description for the activities they do, but it's in their language. And one of the things I always say to people that wants to understand gangs, want to understand the young people of today, you have to understand their language. Because if you don't understand their language, it's going to be difficult for you to engage with them. Now, no one's saying that you need to speak like them. What I am trying to say is that they have their own language, like they've got their own code. They've got their own rules. They have their own lifestyle. Their world runs alongside ours. So their language runs alongside ours. And if you look at some of the words that they've got here, these are considered old. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you some more up-to-date words. So if we look at these words, you can see from the first slide that I put with the street slang that the words are slightly different for the same thing. And the words consistently changes. And one of the reasons why the words consistently changes is because the age group of the young people involved is getting younger and younger. And what we have to do, we no longer can associate gangs with the average 17, 18-year-old. We've got to look at gangs in different spheres. So for instance, the average gang member's age now is 13, 14. Many years ago, when I was involved in a gang back in the 70s, the average was 21, 22. But now what you've got to understand is that things are changing, not only socially, but it's changing through the media and the music that they listen to. So the age group is getting far younger, and that's why the language changes so consistently. And so it's important for us as workers, or for professionals, for anyone engaging with young people who are coming from a vulnerable background, we need to understand their language. We need to understand them. We need to understand what they are living, what their life experience, because there is no point trying to change somebody if you don't understand them. Because, for instance, if they come from Rwanda, so we have many Africans involved in gangs in London, and if they come from a particular area like Rwanda, you need to understand what it means coming from Rwanda, which is a war-torn area, which is civil unrest, which means that a young person may have grown up in an environment where murders take place on a regular basis. So the mindset of a young man involved coming from Rwanda most probably be different from a young kid born to African Caribbean parents here in London, because for him to kill somebody may not be nothing new to him because of his experiences of where he's come from. But if you don't understand the cultural differences within the young people involved in the gangs, whether they be white underclass, whether they be Asian, whether they be black Caribbean, black African, then you're going to end up trying to do a one-size-fits-all, and that cannot work. So let's go to the next slide. Now, this is really important, because this is where radicalized groups, as well as street gangs, really come into their own. They have got the art of really grooming young people. And this is something that we're slow to understand, because we're trying to separate the two. We're trying to make gangs to be a separate issue from radicalized groups, and they're not. Gangs are dealing with economic, they want to make money, they want to make fast money very quickly, and they don't care how they do it. Radicalized groups have an ideology to spread, an ideology that they want to recruit more young people involved in their ideology so that they can spread more of their ideology around. There is no different. The difference is one is doing it through an economic means, that means drug dealing and other aspects of illegal money gains, and the other is doing it through an ideology, a belief system. A system that they believe by getting more young people involved can spread their belief further across in the UK. They're the same. They attract and go for vulnerable children just the same as gang members, no different. You can see them up and down, looking and going around the different estates. It's so easy to find young people who are coming from vulnerable background these days because there are so many deprived estates, so many broken families. We're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of broken families up and down this country, regardless of race, up and down this country, that these groups, gangs, radicalized groups are having a field day, because we're not understanding that the attraction or the grooming process is operating exactly the same as if they were gangs. And that's what we need to understand. These groups go after vulnerable children. And it doesn't matter what the race is. It doesn't matter what background they come from, because what they want to do is spread their evil, whether it be gangs through drug dealing and whether it be radicalized groups. Let's go to the next slide. That the initiation can be working both ways. When we look at the initiation of gang members, that means we're talking about the leader of the gang will tell the young person to go and commit a robbery, maybe go and commit some acts of violence. The same initiation will take place with radicalized groups. And what we have to understand is that if we want to stop gangs and we want to stop radicalization, the only way to stop it is to change the way Britain thinks about broken families. We have to understand that the reason why we're in this position is that we have broken families. And unless we change that, unless we look at our broken family, unless we look at our society and ask ourselves questions, how are we going to change the values of families so that these families do not remain broken, do not remain in a place where the estates are sinking, the estates are so bad that police can't go there, anyone can't go there, it's a no-go area. How are we going to change that? Because that is the only way you're going to stop gangs and radicalization, by changing families, because that is at the heart of this matter. The interventions can't work if the young person has still got to go back home to a broken family. It cannot work. So let's go to the next slide. Now, here we're going to talk about the gang mentality. And we call it gang mentality at Gangsline for a reason, because gang mentality talks about the psychological factors within gang members that no one addresses. Because what we tend to do when we look at young people caught up in radicalizations or young people caught up in gangs, we tend to look at the outwardly approach, i.e. what they've done, whether they've tried to build a bomb, whether they've tried to sell drugs or shot somebody or stabbed somebody or kidnapped somebody, or they've committed some sexually explicit, exploited some girl sexually. We look at the outwardly things of what they do, but we don't actually address the psychological factors of what gang members actually go through. So if we look at this list, this is just a basic list of what a gang member really looks like. The emotional trauma. Many gang members, especially from Black and ethnic minority, experience domestic violence at a very early age when they're in their house, either from their stepdad beating up on their mum or stepdad abusing them. They experience it at a very young age. So seeing violence in some family homes is become normalized. So they grow up thinking that that way of life is normal. Rejection. Some of these kids are rejected by their fathers, rejected, they feel rejected at home, they don't feel a sense of love within the family unit. So they feel rejected, and not just rejected from the family, but they feel rejected from society itself. If we look at loneliness, we see gang members walking around in 5s, 10s, 15, 20 members. Sometimes we see them in their videos. There's 20 of them in a video, 30 of them. Believe me, make no mistake, they are lonely. And I'll tell you why I know this, because I've experienced this myself. As a former gang member, I experienced that even though I had many men, young people around me, I was lonely because no one understood me. I felt I didn't feel a part of my family. And when you don't feel a part of your family, you're looking for something else, but you actually know that the people that you're with are not actually your family. And they really deep down, that is not what you're looking for. And so there comes a sense of loneliness, a sense of you're alone in this. And that's actually a critical state, because that can lead to other things. If we look at anger and hatred and fear, all of those things are some of the fundamental problems that our young men go through and young women go through coming from this background. But these are the things that we don't discuss. These are the things we don't talk about, because it's easy for us to look at the outwardly stuff, the things they do, rather than how have they got here? How did they arrive? How can it become so easy for them to be attracted to gangs, to radicalized groups? How easy is it? And this is the reason why. Because when you have all of these psychological factors going through a young person or a young adult, it makes it easy for them to fall into radicalized groups or gangs and to go out and live that lifestyle because of all of this confusion that they're going through in their lives. Now, what we need to talk about is some solutions, because highlighting the problem is one thing. But how do we deal with it? Well, I gave you some of the answers at the beginning by saying that this can only be done by us fixing families. Now, I know many people may not agree with that, but what we have to understand at the heart of all of this, all the young men caught up in this lifestyle, all the young women caught up in this lifestyle, if you look at a majority of them, over 90% of them come from broken families. And if you look at that figure, there is a direct correlation and a link between those people caught up and incarcerated in prison, coming from broken families. And we have a small percentage coming from middle-class families now because of the music they're listening to. And again, because of the YouTube experience, many of these middle-class kids are listening to these gangster rap, are listening to these gangster grime music, are listening to a lot of these stuff and actually reenacting it in their own lives because they think of it as fun. And so we've got not just kids from deprived backgrounds, living this gang mentality, but we have young people who are coming from well-to-do backgrounds who also have this gang mentality because they feel it's all fun and they feel that they are a part of something. And a lot of young people don't want to be left out of something. They feel it's all fun, so I want to be a part of it. So here are some solutions. If we click the first four, so if we do the next one and the next two. Now, for many of you, you may have done your degree in social work and DIPS as well. Maslow's hierarchy of need is a theory that's been used since 1948. And I know some people may not like this and some people may not agree with it because you may think it's quite dated. But I'm a great believer that when I looked at this the very first time many years ago, I realized that what Maslow was actually trying to say is that the basis of life itself is family. He was actually saying that if a child does not have its biological and psychological needs met, the chances are it won't succeed in life. If the child doesn't feel safe in their environment, that will cause instability. If the child doesn't feel any family affection, no relationships with their parents, and no love in the house, they will look elsewhere for that. If the child feels that he can't achieve in society, he can't get anywhere, and he has no status, he or she will look elsewhere for that. And when I looked at these fundamentals, these four fundamental principles, and I know Maslow's hierarchy of needs goes higher, but I'm just looking at these four basic ones because I feel that these are where we need to be at to begin with. We have to understand that in order for us to make changes, in order for us to change the gang situation, in order for us to change radicalized groups, or for young people not to get attracted to radicalized groups, we've got to change families' thinking. We've got to change the way families are made up these days. And I'm not suggesting for 1 second where I'm talking about the father needs to be in it out. I'm saying that we need to create an environment where fathers are held accountable for their children. In other words, it's not so easy for them to just walk out the family home and take no responsibility. But at the same time, we also need families to understand the importance of building strong relationships with your children. Because when your child does not feel a sense of belonging, a sense of love at home, they will look elsewhere for that. And that is where the attraction of gangs and the attractions of radicalized groups fills that void. It fills that void because they feel, even though they don't know it, that, oh, this is love. They don't realize it isn't real love because they don't realize these groups are using them. But when you're young and you've got so many psychological issues, it is hard for you to understand that you're being used in that way. So what we have to understand is that if we want to fix this problem, we have to fix families. You cannot fix this problem by coming up with interventions that excludes the family, that doesn't look at how can we build strong families so that young people are not attracted so easily to gangs and so easily to radicalized groups. We have not come across girl gangs, standalone girl gangs. What we've come across are lots of girls associated with individual gang members. So an example would be, so if we have one of the gangs from North London, TMD, for an example, and say they have 50 members in that group, in that gang, each one of those members will have at least 5 or 6 girls linked to them individually. And so the links, through those links, those girls are used in various capacities. Some are used as wifey, some are used as side chicks, some are used to sell drugs, some are used to carry the weapons. So it would appear to the outside person who doesn't understand the structures of gangs that, oh, maybe girls are involved in gangs or girls run gangs themselves. They don't. Girls do not bring drugs in. Girls do not organize themselves and control estates like what the boys do. Girls do not go out and start selling drugs without the knowledge of the male members of the gang. So we need to be very careful that we're not trying to push out, because we're not where America is. In America, there are girl gangs. In South America, Guatemala, and other places, there are girl gangs. There's no doubt about that. But in the UK, what we have is lots of girls associated with individuals within gangs who work on behalf of the gang to make money for that gang.